Welcome to the Fall 2021 Dean's Lecture in the Faculty of Fine Arts. I'm Alana Lindgren. I'm the Acting Dean of the Faculty, and I would like to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to thank Dr. Joanne Clark, the Dean of the Division of Continuing Studies, and her colleagues for organizing this lecture series. It's a wonderful way to highlight and celebrate the research and creative work that defines the Faculty of Fine Arts. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Daniel Laskarin, today's speaker. Professor Laskarin came to visual arts and being an artist after a successful career as a helicopter pilot and engineer. He completed his MFA at UCLA in 1991 before joining the Department of Visual Arts here at UVic in 2000. In 2007 and 2008, Professor Laskarin became the inaugural recipient of the Faculty of Fine Arts Teaching Excellence Award in recognition of his superb contributions as a mentor and as a teacher. Professor Laskarin has expertise in a wide range of fields, including sculpture, installation, contemporary art and art theory, and modern art history. As you are about to discover, Professor Laskarin's artwork is elegant, complex, challenging, and deeply inspiring. As one commentator has noted, Daniel is a consummate craftsman who distills concrete images that haunt the unconscious, a truly distinct voice that remains coherent across many disciplinary and material fields. The title of Professor Laskarin's talk today is From a Ragged Edge, Possible Futures. I hope you enjoy the Fall 2021 Dean's Lecture in the Faculty of Fine Arts.
Well, hello, and thank you to Alana for a very fine introduction. I'm going to spend the next little while wandering around through various thoughts and ideas that pertain to my own production, principally as an artist, even though I spend a great deal of my time teaching this material. I want to open up with an image from Expo 86, the World's Fair of that year, held in Vancouver. And this is a picture, as you can see from the label, of the Pavilion of Promise. It was a pavilion sponsored by a religious sect, and it was celebratory of principally Christian religiosity. I visited Expo 86 6 months after it had closed, so I got a very different kind of view of the Grand World's Fair. And I took a lot of photographs. I was very interested in what happened after the big display, after the big spectacle. I filed them, and then sometime later, in running through these older print photographs, I came across the Pavilion of Promise. And since that moment, several years ago, it stood as a marker for me for something quite significant. I think art making is a pavilion of promise. And I think that our worlds are full of many pavilions of promise. This one is in a state of what? Decrepitude. The promise was held out. The promise is coming apart. We don't know about that promise. We don't know what's coming next. But there might be something. There might be something. And I'm interested in that something that comes from the Pavilion of Promise. Related to that, let's look at some of my earlier work. And this first piece I'm going to show is another landmark for me. It might be one of the most boring works of art you could possibly imagine. It's called To Know a Thing. It's a steel bar. It's about 8¼ inches long. It's 1 inch thick. It's 3 inches wide. And I spent roughly a month and a half writing about this in the most neutral, descriptive terms that I could possibly achieve. I recorded that. I boiled it down to a 1-hour tape. And for the showing of it, I had the sound recording, 1-hour duration, playing alongside the visual thing. What I was interested in was that there were two very different ways of knowing things. One was the kind of immediacy of the physicality. You'd see this steel bar, you could look at it, you'd know what it would be to pick it up, to touch it, to hold it. So there's this kind of bodily knowledge of it, which is a really rich kind of knowledge, a really interesting physical thing. It's our bodies, our beings interacting with it. And the other was the overlay of the textual description. The bar existing in a second form represented by language. I'm interested in those two ways of knowing because what I think is that art provides us or proposes a different kind of knowing, a different kind of knowledge. Often when I'm asked about the meaning of my own work, I reply that it doesn't mean. Because meaning, in its very basic semiotic sense, suggests some other existence which is to be indicated by whatever is doing the meaning. So the work of art always refers to something outside itself, to something else. Rather than that, I would hope that people can find a way to approach the work the way you might come across a beautiful flower or a plant or a rock in the forest, a thing that is its own self. And we might have a lot of questions about that thing. We might find resemblances to other things in it, but we find that as viewers, we're still confronted with the thing itself. An anecdote. Earlier this year, the art critic Jerry Saltz, I don't agree with Jerry Saltz on very many things, but there's this. He posted on Twitter, once Leonard Cohen read a whole poem on the radio. The interviewer asked him, "What does that poem mean?" Cohen posed for a long moment and then read the entire poem again. The poem meaning itself, of course. I want to foreground this condition as a way that I look at art and I look at my own work. And in particular, I'd like to foreground our physical relationship to the act of knowing, the way that we can know things through our physicality, through perception, through our engagement with things bodily. So here's an image of forest for the tree. It's a schematic image. And it's a pretty old work now. It was actually my master's thesis project and exhibition. In the schematic, you can see a depiction of a room that was, I believe, 36 feet long. It had 16-foot ceilings and was about 24 feet wide. I put into that room a tree that was suspended upside down, a light standard, and on the opposite wall, a shelf with 23 optical lenses. So here's a picture of the tree. You would enter this gallery space from the California heat, hot, dry, and inside the space, warm but very moist, because I was keeping the tree alive. It had grow lights under it at night. It had, it was being watered regularly. It was a very different atmosphere. So the first encounter with this was suddenly a tree upside down, hanging from the wall. I didn't get approval to drill the holes in the wall, but oops. A little later, you might notice on the opposite wall this shelf. And the optical lenses on the shelf cast corrected images of the tree right side up. Different focal lengths created images of different sizes. Different diameters of the lens created brighter or dimmer images. And in Forest for the Tree, I was interested in the way that we could get caught between an image of the thing and the thing itself. We have had a bodily relationship to the inverted tree, to its physicality, the moisture in the air, the way that it smelled. And then on the other end of the room, there was the magic of the image, right? Now, which do you pick? How do you find yourself between image and object? Between one way of knowing something and another way of knowing something? Which is the more real? Which is the more seductive? How do you get the two to relate to each other? And what is that relationship? That's been a key, one of the keys in the work that I've done. I reiterated that set of ideas in a more recent work called Stack. And in Stack, I found a way to show a set of 45 photographic images that I've taken over time that I really liked for one reason or another. They were personally valuable. They didn't have a particular agenda, but I wanted a way for people to be able to look at them. So Stack is a very heavy welded aluminum structure that houses 10 of these images, no more than 10. The owner of the piece can swap them out for any of the other images from the set of 45, can substitute images, but then has to remove and get rid of one of the ones that I made. What happens here is that the percipient of the work, the person participating in the work, has the potential pleasure of looking at the pictures, but they're objects. They're not just magically present. You feel the paper. You have to put them back into their shelf. You pull them out. So the physicality of the representation becomes a part of the whole structure. You know, you get the pleasure of the pictures, but you also get a kind of consciousness of their construction. So there's a second image of Stack in a domestic environment. It looks a little bit odd against the wall there. And there's Maury Baden, who owns the work now, put a mirror behind it so that you would not only have the experience of examining these photographs, but also the experience of seeing yourself doing it. So there's self-consciousness. There's consciousness of what you're doing. And the work is all about not allowing simple consumption, but rather generating a kind of conscious consumption. It's a little Brechtian, a little bit like the Brechtian alienation technique in theater. And finally, as another example of that mode of work, there's the piece called Ghost. Ghost is formerly, I guess, was a joiner's bench. That is a workbench used for fine joinery and cabinet making and such. And I found this, it was kind of small, it was very used, it had a lot of history. You could read the history of the object right embedded in its surface. And I was quite fascinated by it, so I got it. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And finally, I decided that I would hollow it out, that I would, in a sense, turn it into a picture of itself. So if we look at the detail of that, you can see right through it. Those little rectangular holes would normally be quite thick, and they'd be where braces would be inserted. But here you can see that the whole thing is 1/8 of an inch thick or less. Completely useless, of course, as a joiner's bench. It's kind of a ghost of itself. A hollow shell, still looks like what it was, doesn't function as what it was. It's a picture of itself. It's a ghost of itself, just as pictures may be ghosts. Things do this, though. Things carry something of their history and their meaning with them. They become significant. I want to show a couple of images that have nothing to do with my own art, but that are maybe interesting in terms of some of the ideas I'm thinking about. And these are 2 images of things collected in Il Museo del Quotidiano, Fondazione Museo Ettore Guatelli. It was a rather, esoteric little museum founded by a guy named Ettore Guatelli, who was just a collector. And he collected over 60,000 examples of everyday things and just amassed them. And this has subsequently become a kind of quirky museum. It's a museum where they're just things. And they acquire meaning or memory, or we associate things with them. Things become significant. A story. I recently helped an elderly man move from where he was boarding to a senior's residence. Grant, not his real name, was a hoarder, also facing the onset of dementia, but still more or less able to deal with daily life. As a hoarder, without much money, he made frequent trips out into some world that I don't know and brought back things. There was no absolute character, but it seemed to me that they were all things that related one way or another to a time in his life in which he was able, efficacious, a bush pilot, an aircraft mechanic, a businessman. There were tools, none of which would match the quality of those that he worked with. Sunglasses, flashlights, gloves, clothes, and especially belts and shoes, a lot of belts and shoes. Perhaps in these things he was able to find his former life, to enact something that was once every day, to connect, in fact, to his very sense of self, of being. Grant, getting ready to move, paced, shuttled about the house, out and back in, to the garage, then to his room, looking frustrated for the key to his Ford truck, which was stored elsewhere, where he would never have access because of owing $5,000 in back rent that he'd never have capacity to gain, like his ability to hold memories or thoughts. The things he collected, each a link to something else, an unrepeatable past. His small quantity of personal goods were being loaded into his son's truck, readying to take him to his new home. And he added a 6-foot-long solid steel wrecking bar, carried that towards the back of the truck. A thing that apparently evoked the thoughts or memory or consciousness of all that could be done with it, that might be done with it. All of these things loaded with his past that was slipping away. Things and the way they accrue meaning for individuals as well as more broadly, socially, conventionally. And for each person, that things will get linked to or locked into different other things, different and the same, always changing. The 20th century philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty wrote about the idea of sedimentation, things accruing meaning through a process that is not unlike sedimentation. In my art practice, to bring this back to that, I'm very interested in the kind of bodily interaction that was in Forest for the Tree, because it's a testing point. It's through that testing point and through the way that objects react or fail to react to us, that things get, ideas and sediment get broken up, tested, retested, and might be changed. I'll talk more now about these ideas of time and history, and again, the Pavilion of Promise, and the way that things might emerge from broken pasts, in particular broken pasts. Another image alongside the Pavilion of Promise is that of the way that grasses break up through concrete. The slightest crack in a bit of pavement very quickly greens up. So I'll look at a work that was very, it was kind of a culminating point. It was a sweet moment. It's called How a Thing is Made. And here's an installation shot of it. I'll show some details shortly. I had a little table, a little bench in my studio. It had been here for years, used for 10 years for various things. Things got propped on it, sat on it, I stood on it, whatever. One day a couple boards fell on it. And they fell in an odd way. It was quite precarious. And that precarity, that seems pretty important these days. So I was interested in that. I let that thing sit there for months. And I finally decided to see what I could generate from it. So I let the I let the boards that had fallen onto it form as models for aluminum substitutes, and I replaced those. And then I needed to raise it up off the ground. Well, to raise it up off the ground, I could just do it arbitrarily, or I could let the terms of that table, the structure of that table and its formal properties, its geometries, influence the way that I raised it up off the ground. Here we'll look at a detail of the little bench and its upper components. And in starting to allow the bench to determine its own future, but interjecting different materials, things that I had, things that were available, and some things that I got specifically to do this, the shape of the original started to transform itself into something else. Another detail here shows the top plank with a peg coming through it. Well, I needed that peg because that top plank in aluminum wouldn't balance the way the original had. So I had to drill a hole in the aluminum. So then that led to the decision to put a similar hole in a piece of webbing that held together the two main structural supports for this little bench. The geometry of the little bench formed the set of legs on one end of its support. So each decision emerged from the original object and generated new possibilities. So it became generative and transformative. That sort of stands for a way of dealing with the past that acknowledges it, but is not bound by it, that uses the breaks in the past, the ruptures in the seamlessness of history, apparent seamlessness of history. Well, lots of seams in history, but here we go. That use those ruptures or breaks or seams to transform things, to generate something not previously thought of or not previously put together. It came time to do an exposition, to do a show of this work. And I decided that I would deal with this idea of ruins and reclamation. And so I accompanied this piece, How a Thing is Made, with some paintings I had done for my very first professional exhibition as an artist. And those were little paintings. They were part of a larger installation, but I reused them in a different way. They were paintings the size of a 35mm slide, very little, that I made from photographs that I had taken the same days that I did the photographs of the Pavilion of Promise, 6 months after Expo 86 closed. So the first image here shows 3 of those small paintings on a larger panel. And then we can zoom in on the 3 little paintings. And finally, individually, 1, 2, and 3 of them. Each of those shows a fragment of wreckage. And it was the wreckage of Expo 86. And finally, here's an image, a partial image at least, of the installation for that exhibition, for ruins and reclamation, where you can see one end of How a Thing is Made, and in the background you can see 3 of the panels of these small paintings. So the ruins generated finally a new work, just as the table had generated a new work. One more recent work, Broken as If Open. I was driving through one of the streets of Victoria, and I came across a pile of rubble on the side of the street. It was some kind of little, very high-end figurine. I think it had been in a garden. It showed signs of that, but it was shattered. And I rescued it, not knowing what to do with this ruin. And I eventually came to want to hold it in this state that was partly reassembled, partly apart. And so here's a detail of that piece, Broken as If Open, where I wanted to hang on to the broken condition of it, so that this object could be a little bit haunted, to speak of its past, but also importantly, speak of its present. The 20th century social theorist Walter Benjamin wrote of the Paul Klee painting Angelus Novus as the angel of history, in which the angel is turned toward the past, being propelled into the future to which his back is turned while the wreckage of history piles up at his feet. This image and this bit of Benjamin's writing has been used a lot in the field of visual arts, so I'm certainly not unique in using it. But it is still a very powerful image, because we do back into the past. We don't ever really see the future. We only see some aspect of the past that we imagine going forward. So that's a problem, and it's a problem in particular for photography, I think, because photographs are always of the past. Every photograph you've ever taken, the moment after you've taken it, it's part of the past. Rebecca Solnit, in an essay in her book, The Encyclopedia of Trouble and Consciousness, wrote, "Maybe the problem is pictures, that we think in pictures, and we want to. The point of a wedding may be to reduce the weather-like volatility of a relationship into an authoritative picture of cake, happiness, lace, and rented tuxedo." I think it's not just weddings. I think pictures can mask the volatility of events, and thought itself may get anchored in something or in some image in the same way. We need to break up the sediment that Maurice Merleau wrote about. We need to break up those ideas. We need to break up, not make invisible, but to break up history, to take it apart, in order to be able to salvage something through it. We need to make space for the grass to come up through the cracks. These pictures are like memory, often. I mean, they're of the past. Maybe they are memory. Maybe that's what memory is. And certainly a lot of mileage has been gotten from the recent observation that many of our memories are memories of the pictures that were taken of an event rather than of the event as such. So, Instagram takes the place of really remembering something. However, as much as I may be critical of it, I'm also engaged with the fascination with pictures. As you may have surmised from what you've seen so far, I do have a relationship to photography. It's a little bit complex. It lies between being fascinated by it and being quite critical of it. And part of the criticality is the way that it is always of history, or has this sense of being historical. As we see in the image that's on the screen now, that is a source image for a work that I made. Recently, I've undertaken a different way of picture making that is related to but isn't photography. It uses photogrammetry software. And this is an image made from the scene just seen in the previous picture. In photogrammetry, I'll take between 30 and 60 or 80 photographs of a given scene, feed them into the software, which generates a 3D model of that scene. Then I use other computer software to spin it, manipulate it, edit it, but never reshape it, although they may crop bits out. And from that, I can pick a particular perspective and generate a new image. The photogrammetry image is pretty special to me because it is capable of manifesting in the image itself something of the qualities that were present in the original scene. So if we look at Stockpile, if you look at the left-hand side of that image, you can see the ragged painterly edges of it. The image comes apart so that the medium does not masquerade as something whole, as something complete, but the picture's a little bit broken, the way the past is a little bit broken. And I've done a series of these works. I guess they riff off the idea of ruins and reclamation. These will be the ruins. But in every ruin, I think there's a sign of promise, or the potential for promise. And I guess land developers have the same kind of perspective. They look at a site of ruin and see the possibility for redevelopment. I am more interested in that moment, and it's usually a very brief moment, in which an abandoned site or a site of ruin exists with relaxed or sometimes even eliminated controls. Other things are possible. Other possibilities arise. And they may be possibilities that are not yet imagined and not yet predetermined or controlled. They may not be economic possibilities. They may be something that we haven't quite arrived at yet. Here's a series of these works. The second one is simply called Grit. And I'm showing that because of the character of the way that the original object comes apart. You know, I mentioned Brechtian alienation. We're conscious of looking at the picture and looking at looking at our own consciousness of the picture. In a way, the kind of physicality that I embed in works that play between image and object, here I think is embedded right in the image itself. Or work table. Or from what remains. And finally, with every ruin, a future. Leonard Cohen again. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And I think the cracks in these sites of abandonment or sites of ruin are really valuable. So my work, though, is largely, not entirely, but largely exploratory and speculative. And in constructing work, I am led by it as much as I lead it, just as was the case for how a thing is made. The only choice I have, finally, is when to stop. There's this kind of ongoing process between me and the work, and I get to decide when to stop, but other than that, the conversation may go on. If I think of the sites of abandonment or the sites of ruin and the possibility of reclamation, and if I ask myself, what if meaning is cut loose from what is already known? What if an object could be meaningful but without referent? That is, have a sense of meaningfulness, but without having a specific reference. What if a work was a proposition for something unknown, a platform for we don't know what? What if the work of art lay just behind Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, facing backwards, about to back into the sculptural work? The painter Ad Reinhardt is noted to have said that sculpture is what you bump into when you back up to look at a painting. My response to that is that when you bump into the sculpture, then you know you're alive and present. I want to show a series of recent works that are predicated on these ideas loosely. They're all based on the notion of a work table, but a work table for a job not yet known. You know, every table has an implied use, whether it's a kitchen table, a workbench, a computer table, etc., etc. What if we had tables that were cut loose from that served as platforms for the imaginary, platforms for some solution not known? So here's the first of these. Support for a solution not yet imagined. It's kind of a flimsy table. It's a bit precarious, like the future. Here are a couple slides moving in on it, a close-up of the tabletop, and then a detail. In this third detail, you can see on the edge of the table a little bit of red plastic insert that filled a void that was there. One of the accidents of the work, one of the accidents of the material that led me to take another course of action. In support for an imaginary promise, I built a little sub-platform that I could put a drinking glass on. It's all about suggesting without telling, indicating without forcing. The third of these is called Axes for an Other Possibility. And here's a detail. The axes are not at 90 degrees to each other. They're a little bit random. One of them is supported by a rock with a hole drilled in it. Oh, and there's a rock on the base of this piece as well. I quite often incorporate natural materials, other materials, just to kind of mitigate the wholeness or the sleekness that might creep into my work. These are works that are, in a way, aimed toward the future, but they're also aimed toward jostling the senses and stirring the sediments of a crude meaning to make space for something else. I hope for them to work as a dance of the imagination without prescription. I hope for them as works that don't say anything, but that actually disrupt the saying of things to create the experience of not yet knowing but present. A couple more. The future is not yet known, and a detail of that. And then support for an unknown question. I try to make these beautiful, but beautiful in an awkward way. You know, beautiful in a way that doesn't resolve itself into easy balance or easy symmetries, so that they remain a little bit unsettled. And they are precarious. They potentially wobbly, potentially mobile. So that pairing of the photogrammetry images with their relationship to the past and the potential that can emerge from a breaking of the past, paired with these other works that might imagine or create the space for imagining some other future possibilities. Those seem to be a way that I'm able to deal with thinking about the world that I inhabit without mimicking it, without becoming didactic about it or prescriptive about it. I want to finish with one last work. It's called A Game for Two Players. I made this also when I was in grad school, and my supervisor looked at it with great displeasure and said, "Daniel, you should go and study game theory." And I did a little bit, and then I sidelined this thing. And then I stored it, and I came across it again very recently. Pulled it out, and I thought, a game without rules, a game for two players. It's a game without rules. It's between two players. There are no guides, no guidelines, no points of resistance. The players sit, I don't know, do they sit on the long ends or across the short ends? There are no sides marked out. There are no indications of a goal. Players, though, have to find some point of agreement, radical or conservative. I suppose there will be a tendency to base the new rules on the old ones. The character of the game itself, though, makes this very difficult. There's no symmetry, no direction, no hierarchy. My partner and I sat down to play this a few days ago. And she's a performer, an actor. A good opponent for a game with no rules. It was all improv. And we had to find a point of agreement without anything pre-given to base it on. We had a lot of fun with it. There were no winners. There were no losers. The shiny, beautiful, round steel balls were fun to play with. The game moved back and forth. And I think that is an openness to the future. I think that is a sense of the agility that we need to address what we don't know. I think it's a possibility without guidelines that are written already. Thank you.